Can you see me? Shalom and bonjour. First, let me say that, like Rabbi Steinsaltz, I am not a professional speaker. However, I am a professional listener. The title of my paper is The Stigmatization of Unsung Heroes. It was difficult for me to prepare it, for it evoked painful memories of my own experiences, as well as those of the survivors and their children who have passed through my office carrying the burden of their legacy. What is this legacy? What is this legacy and how can it be passed on to future generations in a constructive and meaningful way? My major point is that we have to change this legacy from the stigma of victim to that of a moral and spiritual victor. As I scanned the psychoanalytic literature on survivors and their children, I found that much of the research was based on a diagnostic assessment called the survivor's syndrome. This categorization, which was established as a base for the German reparations in the 50s and the 60s, relied heavily on pathology and has created a stigmatized image which needs to be redressed. Dr. Nederland, who formulated the Holocaust syndrome, describes it as survivor's guilt, chronic anxiety, tension, depression, persecutory nightmares. These classifications have unfortunately found their way into the literature and have unfairly stigmatized many survivors. I once attended a lecture open to the general public on Holocaust survivors and their trauma. It was given by a prominent psychiatrist. Next to me sat a tall, elegant woman, well-groomed, beautifully dressed, and as we say in French, elle était tirée à quatre épingles. She looked proud and confident. As the lecturer began to expound on the pathology sustained by the survivors and damage done to their children, I felt my anger rising. I involuntarily turned my head and noticed that this proud woman sitting next to me had slid down in her chair, her shoulders hunched over, her face no longer visible. She had changed from a proud person to a defeated woman. I conducted an informal survey in which I asked people, unconnected to the Holocaust, what their image of the survivor was. Their responses were tuned in exclusively on the pain, terror, and helplessness of the survivors. Not one tuned in to the inner strength and courage it took to survive the inferno. There was no awareness that alongside the horror, valiant attempts were made to maintain their dignity and hold on to their values. And there was no listening ear available, and so they had to turn to each other for solace, support, and temporary relief. As to the second generation, they too have now been stigmatized by a classification called children of survivor syndrome. Loosely defined, destructive identification with the parents who refuse autonomy to their children, the parental use of children as transference objects for their unexpressed rage, death anxiety communicated to the child as overprotectiveness, and death guilt translated into feeling of worthlessness. Norman Salkoff, who did a study found that these statements are without any supporting data, and they must be viewed as speculations. Anna Ornstein, too, questions the assumption that survivor parents exploit their children emotionally. These labels have stigmatized the survivors and their offspring. They have been picked up now by the media and made their way into the public consciousness. The time has come to redress the situation. Out of empathy with their pain, we have focused on the suffering of survivors. But in that process, we have lost sight of their moral and spiritual resistance that enabled them to survive, to form new relationships, to marry, to bring children into this world, and make important contributions to Israel and Jewish communities around the globe. I am calling for the integration of the spiritual resistance with the trauma, which hopefully could remove the stigma and change the survivor's legacy from being a burden to one that not only their children can be proud of, but can serve as a source of inspiration for future generations. For in the deepest sense, the survivors have affirmed the eternity of the Jewish people, that truly Am Yisrael Chai.
Thank you, Shoshana. And finally, I'd like to call on Shalmi Balmore to end up our session for this morning.